This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, dedicated to promoting young American pianists and making Chopin's music accessible to all. The third movement of Chopin's Second Sonata is one of the most recognizable pieces of music ever composed. But ever since historians started to dig into its history, questions have emerged about the piece's origins and even the authorship of one of its melodies. In an effort to answer these questions, University of Pennsylvania professor Jeffrey Kahlberg has pieced together evidence that will make you rethink the meaning of this so-called funeral march. I'm grateful to Jeff for once again hopping on a video call to discuss the forensics of Chopin's compositions and developing the characters of a fascinating story that is still being written.
So one place to start the story is with thinking about Chopin opus numbers, right? One of the things that is generally true about Chopin opus numbers is that they're kind of accurate about chronology, right? So for the most part, and there's a famous exception with the concertos where the later concerto has the earlier opus number, and that tells us something about what piece was most popular when he first got to Paris and why the publishers wanted to publish the second concerto before the first one. One of the other interesting anomalies is the opus number of the preludes, which is opus 28. Except everything else that he published around that time was in the late 30 numbers, so 36, 37, 38. And that opus number was left over, and his publishers knew that, and he knew it, and they decided to use that leftover number. And it was left over from 1835, when we have him offering a four-hand sonata to the German publisher Breitkopf and Härtel. And that sonata was given the opus number 28 in that contract.
So then there was an opus number to fill, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that was never used, and so he they kind of left that opus number out when he published the pieces that he had sold them at that time. That included the Polonaise, the Grand Polonaise, and Andante Spianato. I got that backwards. The Ballade, the first set of Polonaises, Opus 26, and the Nocturnes, Opus 27, was part of this initial contract. And Opus 28 in that contract was a four-hand sonata.
And that four-hand sonata you mentioned ends up being relevant to our funeral.
Yeah, and so I'm starting there because it would have been very unusual for Chopin to offer a piece for publication that was not almost done. So we can presume that a four-hand sonata existed of some sort. We don't know what it contained, but we know that they were sort of thinking about a sonata. Therefore, for Chopin, from the mid 1830s, right, from 1835 or so on, he would have been thinking about sonatas in general. And in the 1830s in Paris, the sonata was a kind of old-fashioned genre. It wasn't very popular. The heyday of the sonata was, had been in the 1820s and before. The 1830s was a kind of fallow period, and it only recovered as a popular genre in the later 1840s. So it was a sort of unusual thing to write a sonata. So that's the first thing. Sort of, there's this thing lurking in the background of around 1835. The next date of note is November 1837, where we have a presentation manuscript, which we only have a photograph of. It came up for sale in New York in the 1950s. We don't know who bought it, where it went. We don't know anything about what it was before. But what that contains in 1837 in November is the melody of the trio of the third movement of the sonata, the middle portion of the sonata, and just that melody and the date, Paris, November 28, 1837, Chopin signed it. And so therefore that melody we know existed 2.5 years before the publication of the rest of the sonata. We don't know if that melody belonged to the sonata at that point, whether it was part of this earlier four-hand sonata, but it's a fact that we need to reckon into this. So when you see dates of the sonata, of the second sonata out there, and they mention 1837 as the possible early date of composition, that's where that date comes from, that manuscript. So we know that Chopin, really began working hard on the sonata in 1839, and that's when he set about trying to get it published. And he was working at this point with a different French publisher than he normally worked with. So he normally worked with Maurice Schlesinger, who was a German, had a brother Adolf who worked in Berlin as a publisher. Schlesinger was a kind of complicated figure in various sorts of ways. He got into a duel with another publisher over the rights to a piece, and there was all sorts of stuff going on around Schlesinger all the time. And for whatever reason, Chopin had a kind of falling out with him, and he decided to take up with the publisher Eugène Troupenas, Troupenas, and so he published the sonata, the second impromptu, the Opus 37 nocturnes, the second ballade, the third scherzo, the Polonaises Opus 40, and the Mazurkas Opus 41, all with Troupenas in one kind of big contract that they were published at different times. For reasons that we don't know, every one of those publications was troubled. We know that they were released all of them in multiple versions. There were complications in the printing. Again, we don't know why exactly, whether it was mistakes that were made, Chopin changing his mind. We just don't really know all that much about what the particular circumstance was. Chopin was always having arguments with his publishers, we know, and so it could well have been that. So the sonata was part of this, as we know, and so the relevant fact is that we have 4 different states, is the technical term that we use, of the first edition of the Chopin B-flat minor sonata. And the third movement is the most interesting one to see, although there are interesting things in the other movements as well. But in the third movement, in states 1 and 2, it's called, as we all know it today, most familiarly, in French, Marche Funèbre, funeral march. But in state 3, the adjective funèbre is dropped, and it's just called march, and he puts in a tempo marking of lento, which he adds for the first time. And there are other musical changes that are made along the way. There are lots of mistakes or compositional changes that are made. And then there's a 4th state as well, where it stays march, and that's how it remained for the rest of Chopin's life. That change was interesting, of course. I mean, it's the most famous funeral march in the world, I would argue, and yet, Chopin is not wanting to call it funeral march.
Well, you speculate in your article that it could relate to Chopin's resistance to sort of Berlioz style program associations.
Right. Yeah. There's certainly that.
Which, by the way, was a very French thing to be happening during this decade, and yet writing sonatas was not. So here's Chopin writing a sonata and stripping it of its programmatic associations. I think also, we need to remember that, Chopin knew other funeral marches. One of his favorite Beethoven sonatas was Opus 26, the A flat, and he knew and played that sonata with its funeral march. Before I get to that, one thing that is notable in all of the letters that Chopin mentions this piece, he never calls it funeral march. He only calls it the march. But do we have letters between Chopin and those early publishers who did call it a funeral march, in which that's how he labeled it? But unfortunately, do you suspect that he might have casually referred to it as that and then walked it back later? Or do you think the editors were the ones who imposed Funeral March onto the movement?
That's a good question. I would be, my supposition would be that Chopin, did put Funeral March in whatever source went to Troupanoff for engraving. It would have been pretty unusual for one of his French publishers to add a title like that to a movement on their own accord. So it might have been a kind of rethinking on Chopin's part, not just to his opposition to Berlioz, but also the sense of what kind of march this is. In other words, I talk in the article that, the more proximate march that is most similar comes from a Rossini opera from Legazza Ladra, Act 2, which Rossini known as a funeral march. But it's really, again, using a Berlioz term, it's a march to the scaffolding, a marche au supplice in French, from the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, where the condemned is being marched, to the final moment. The condemned stops, sings a prayer, and then the march resumes, and the supposed, event where the person is killed by guillotine or whatever happens off stage, as it were. So it's not a march that is a funeral march in the normal French sense of someone has died, you're marching to the ceremony or you're marching to the cemetery, but rather it's the march, of the condemned as they're being led to their death. And so, that would need a different kind of title than the funeral march, perhaps in Chopin's mind.
That's interesting because it would change a lot of our associations with the piece and even how it's been appropriated as a piece to play at the funerals of great leaders,
right,
these sorts of things.
Well, and was certainly appropriated in his own time, right? It was the march played at his own funeral, right? Famously, in an arrangement which I found the parts for in the Bibliothèque Nationale, so one could actually play it was Rebert who made the arrangement of the march. And
what's the ensemble?
Brass, so brass band. Yeah,
I feel like that's probably how I first heard the piece in a cartoon. At some point, was that some arrangement like that. So if this is a march to the scaffolds for the condemned, then that middle section also changes its meaning. You said maybe that means some kind of prayer, praying for their souls or something, rather than someone's soul maybe ascending into heaven or something like that.
Yeah, and I think, if there's a kind of narrative to be thought of in this sonata, if what I'm speculating is correct, it is, the person, praying for their own soul or for their, absolution before the end, a kind of last rites, and the death happens between the third and fourth movements, if you will, and so the guillotine has fallen or whatever, and then the last movement is the after effects, right?
Coming back to the funeral march or the march movement, what we call the trio, although it's not really a trio,
it's not called that.
Is unusual because it may have been composed before or separately from the march, and it has a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we know, from that manuscript that I described earlier, the melody at least predated the rest of the sonata, right? He wrote the melody down in November 1837. Right? So this melody has drawn people's attention for various reasons. And so one of the things that was noted by Marmontel, the French writer on piano music in the late 1860s, in a book that he wrote, was that he's sort of, writing about the sonata. He said, by the way, the melody, part of the melody of that trio is exactly the same as a melody from the Weber Clarinet Quintet.
Could I actually could I play that for us?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Pretty close.
It's a question mark. Chopin, like everybody at that time, would have known Weber's music pretty well, although we don't really have any evidence of him knowing, the chamber music all that well. So that's interesting fact number one. There's this melodic parallel between these two pieces.
That's been known about for a long time.
For a long time,
like,
but actually kind of forgotten. So Marmontel wrote this in the 1860s, and almost nobody in the literature, Chopin literature, ever mentions this. It could have been chance, absolutely, but maybe it wasn't chance. And what does it mean if it's not chance?
At least the 2 or 3 bars of the tune are, almost identical. So that, coincidences are possible. It's pretty diatonic,
Yeah.
So it's not conclusive, but it's interesting that somebody in the 19th century pointed that out, at least. So
right, yeah. So the second similar kind of story is in a way much more obscure. The way to tell this is how I learned about this. The Chopin Institute in Warsaw has been hosting conferences for musicologists for quite a long time, and at some point in the early 2000s, I met a Spanish musicologist named Maria Nagor Ferrer. In 2010, which was the year of a lot of big Chopin conferences, there was, of course, a big congress in Warsaw. And she was slated to give a paper, and she mentioned in this talk, it was about looking at the way that Chopin's music, might have influenced the development of the Spanish piano sound. One of the things at the beginning, she said, there's this piece by the Spanish composer named Santiago de Masarnau, a preludio, opus 18, the beginning of which sounds kind of like the trio from the Chopin funeral march, as she put it. And that's all she said. She played a little bit of it, and I said, yes, by God, that does sound like the trio from the funeral march. So, but she just talked about the beginning, and when I then tracked down the score, I realized there was more to it. That not only does the beginning sound kind of like the funeral march, if you get 2/3 of the way into the piece and the tune comes back, the melody of the funeral march is quoted. I mean, undoubtedly quoted in the bass of the, and it's in entirety in the bass of the Masarnau preludio.
Let's take a listen to the beginning of the Masarnau. So that's certainly a fragment, and then it goes in a new direction.
Right.
But then we get here.
Here it comes.
Yeah, so that characteristic seventh,
right,
leap up a seventh is there. I mean, it is really note for note here. So, because
exactly.
if it had just been the opening, then it's another one of these. I mean, even the Weber is more similar because it has the right leap.
So the next question is, when did he write this piece? And in the literature on Masarnau, again in Spain, he's been written about, and there were, the dates on this were quite variable from 1836 to 1842, and they none of them cited any evidence. They just sort of threw the dates out. So I enlisted the help of Krzysztof Grabowski, who, if you've used the online Chopin Variorum edition or Chopin Online in general, he with John Rink is one of the two people who put this, who did all the work on the dating of Chopin first editions. So Christophe knows the Parisian libraries and archives better than anyone around, particularly around issues of publication. And I got him to kind of help me out with this one because there was the obvious places to go for dates for this, which are the registers, the copyright registers. They didn't mention this piece. Again, Masarnau was not all that well known, and not everything got entered into the copyright registers. So, but he did dig around and found there are two things relevant. So that the bottom of each of the pages is a number. The pages of the edition is a number, which is the plate number. So this one of the ways that publishers used to basically catalog their stock was to put numbers for each of the plates, and they could kind of keep track of what they wanted to do when it was time to print new copies. And sometimes those plate numbers help us date when pieces were put out. For some publishers, not all publishers, they work more or less chronologically, kind of like opus numbers in that sense. So in this case, that helped kind of narrow things down to sort of 1839 to 1841 or so, but still kind of vague. You'd like to know a little bit more. Christophe then found a catalog of the publisher. The publisher is, by the way, Richaud, the same Richaud who published the four-hand version of the Weber Clarinet Quintet. Found a catalog of Richaud with the Masarnau listed in it. The catalog was printed in 1840, but it's clear from the contents that the contents in it refer to later 1839. And so various other kind of more detailed clues about the other pieces that are surrounding it suggest that the most likely date of the Masarnau publication was the summer of 1839. So when's the date of the Chopin first editions of the March? Well, no earlier than the spring of 1840, right? So the four states were all released within about four months or so from the middle spring to the early summer of 1840. So the likelihood is that this Masarnau piece was published before the Chopin.
And that's significant because then you can more or less conclude he wouldn't have just been quoting a Chopin piece he found published.
Exactly right. It wasn't some,
either it's a pretty big coincidence that the themes are there, or
yeah,
he knew about this theme and Chopin also knew about this theme, and that's the next question is
right. Yeah, right.
How did they both
know about this theme? Well, so after Masarnau left Paris in 1842, 1843, he went back to Spain and kind of left composition, although he still played piano, and became known for establishing the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Spain. It was a kind of pastoral cause in some ways, and that's what he devoted the rest of his life to, and became quite well known in Spain because of that, and because of that work, people wrote about him late in his life, sort of biographies of him from the later 19th century. And when we have a couple of these 19th century biographies, and they both contain an anecdote about three composers getting together in the late 1830s in social circumstances, the three composers being Masarnau, Chopin, and Alkan, the Charles-Valentin Alkan, the great virtuoso and friend of Chopin's. The anecdote basically has them, sitting around together in 1838 or so, and Masarnau plays a piece, and Chopin says, "Oh, I like some of that. Here, let me take the tune of it and turn it into something else." And what that something else turns out to be in the anecdote, as it presented, is the A minor waltz, Opus 34, number 2.
Man, all these A minor waltzes.
I know. It's just all we can talk about are A minor waltzes, and the third composer in this was Alkan, right, and he was sort of present in there. So we know there are problems with this anecdote because the A minor waltz would have already been composed, before the time of the anecdote. But it's it's putting these three composers together in a way. And so that made me go look and say, well, all right, we have, there's Masarnau has this piece in it, this tune that we have Chopin with this tune. What about Alkan? Did he ever write a piece that has something like this working in it? And so, as it turns out, the next piece that I'm sure you have queued up is the Trois Etudes de Bravoure from Alkan, Opus 12B, where there's a similar kind of melody. Again, it's less exact, but it seems to me evocative of the same spirit, if you will.
And it's in a B minor
Yes, right.
piece.
A B minor context,
And
right? Yeah,
this is a D major middle section, so it's just a half step
right.
up from Chopin's
Yeah,
key scheme. So
right.
this is the middle section of this etude.
So that last bass line is it's almost like the Masarnau citation, right? You know, it cheats us of this rising seventh. But
Yeah, and I guess Chopin never takes his theme into the bass like that.
no, never. Yeah,
Although
yeah,
that is the kind of thing Chopin would do. So this is
yeah,
similar to the Masarnau.
yeah.
It's still I mean, the themes are still similar. The rhythms are practically the same.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
The rhythms and the contour are similar. It doesn't have the
Right.
characteristic leap, but there is a leap later in it. It's got a different chromatic
Yes.
note in it, but
Right.
seems to belong to that family. If there weren't any of this other circumstantial evidence, probably no
Yeah.
one
Probably.
would
Yeah.
have even
It
really
would. Yeah.
noticed or cared. But
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But all three together is pretty interesting. And Alkan's publisher was Richaud, the same publisher who seems to be mixed up in all of this. Chopin did not publish with Richaud, at least right then. I think there was one piece that he did with Richaud later,
But if you're a detective and you're working on a case, then
right,
I don't know if you actually
yeah,
do this, but you'd probably have a board with pictures of these three individuals, and you'd be like connecting dots, and
yeah, pin
it's
strings,
it's enough evidence to maybe get a warrant or something. You know what I mean?
right,
It's
exactly, right, yes, right, yeah,
I don't know.
something.
I probably watch too much true crime, but you know what I mean? It's like
Yes, yeah, I know
it's
exactly.
not
Yeah,
nothing.
it's not nothing. Yeah. So take a step back first of all and say Chopin and Alkan were good, really close friends. With this, we know. Um, there is no evidence whatsoever anywhere in Chopin's correspondence of him, knowing Masarnau. None whatsoever. Zero hints anywhere that put them together directly. Back to the anecdote, one thing that I wondered, so la minor, right, la minor, I guess in Spanish, uh, you know, what if what if Masarnau misremembered this? So there's the F minor waltz, the one that he gave as a gift. If you take that tune, and actually you can take one of the, there are five
Oh my
different
gosh, it's
manuscripts.
a similar tune.
It is
Da
the same.
da 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 da.
Yeah, instead of going down a second, it goes up a seventh. You've got the same tune.
Wow.
Yeah, and so uh, and there's I tell you, there's a version that he wrote at the beginning that where he ties over in pencil, so that the rhythm works out exactly the same as it does in the
Whoa.
trio as well. I
He
can
never
send you that.
published that one, but he loved writing it down and giving it as a gift.
Yeah, it's a gift, but that's again,
Perhaps
it's a little later, but maybe it was still
but
hovering around
it might have been
earlier
swimming in his
on,
head.
and
So
that fa minor rather than la minor. I mean,
all of this suggests that it's possible, maybe even probable, that this was a tune that was just floating around Europe, and that
yeah,
Weber
or
didn't even necessarily come up with either,
yeah,
maybe. Or do you think
yeah.
it's could have been original of Weber, and then that started a kind of people whistling it on the street or whatever, and suddenly it's a
Well,
tune that people
or
hear?
I mean, so again, this is pure speculation. The Richaud is the publisher of Masarnau and Alkan. They're getting stuff from Richaud. They're sitting around with Chopin one night, and they've got this. They're playing forehand stuff, and they got this tune. And it's boy, this is kind of cool. What? Let's put something on the front end of it and make a whole tune out of this, and then they could decide, well, let's this will be our tune. We're going to all have a kind of secret reference to it, in three of our pieces, and it'll just be our own kind of in joke, or in, sign of friendship, or however you want to put it. I mean, it has that possibility as well. Again, pure speculation. We don't know that for sure.
I mean, if this was a kind of inside joke between the three of them, Chopin made sure that his friends knew and everybody else knew
Yeah.
his was the best. because the
oh,
way he
absolutely.
develops
Right.
the theme is just
Yeah.
one of the
It's
saddest
extraordinary.
things that anyone's ever
Yeah.
heard. So
No, you weep when you hear it. One other interesting biographical fact, three of the main figures, Chopin, Alkan, and Masarnau, had personal crises right around 1837 that are known sort of. So Chopin, the breakup with Maria Wodzinska, and then sort of before he takes up with Georges Sand. Alkan, there was something that went awry with some person that he was supposedly romantically involved with, and he, was a bachelor for the rest of his life. And Masarnau had a religious conversion of sorts that happened. That was the thing that led him ultimately to leave composition and do the St. Vincent de Paul things. But it was all right around the same time, right?
all
Interesting.
right, so just three bros getting together
Yes.
after their breakup. Now they're writing pieces about funeral marches with soul. I mean,
It's a lot of
I
stuff
wonder
going
what
on.
these funerals are actually for. Maybe it's
Yeah,
their
who
who
knows?
knows.
Yeah,
But I think we can at least definitively say this: this music and this sonata comes out of really rich human social
right.
context, whatever they might be. And it seems like you've found a window for us to look in and actually kind of make out something like a plausible picture of social connections that may have given rise to this piece. But whatever they might be, will probably forever remain mysterious. We can get as close as we can with historical records, but it's an indisputable fact that music must arise from such human context.
Right.
It's almost, it's a
Yeah.
truism, even
Right.
though when we encounter the music, it's so abstract. It seems like it kind of exists in a vacuum, or it fell from the sky. And so I think it's really interesting, although maybe not necessary for pianists who play this music to
Oh, yeah.
necessarily know or care about all these things. And yet when one does, and then you relearn it, or you re-listen, or you learn it for the first time and you play it again, it does feel like we have a more human interpretation. We can
Yeah.
have a sort of more intimate contact, I guess, with
Right.
the music.
I think the whole biographical context aside, it's a very interesting story, and it's the kind that that attracts me. But I think the understanding, just the story of the disappearance of the adjective, and we pianists at least are Beethoven oriented, and we assumed that the funeral march was coming from a Beethovenian tradition. But by far the more famous funeral march in Chopin's day would have been the Rossini Ragazza Ladder March. It was a really big piece. And, the notion that, Chopin, the operaphile, would have been modeling a march on his operatic experience, and understanding that, that this was the march of the convicted, as opposed to the march of someone who has already died, I think would be really important for pianists as they think about the piece, in the way that it would have been understood in Chopin's time. Why he might have been so insistent on taking that word funeral out of the title, and why he never called it that himself, in all of the references that we have.